Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight I wanted to take a slightly different tack and do something I may regret, but I'm going to do it nonetheless. And this is, I want to address a question that I've received probably, I don't know, 30 times, 40 times from people, which is what do I think of Jordan Peterson? And I've been hesitant to do this because I don't like controversy. I like to be positive. I think there's a grand world of ideas out there to explore, and I think discussion is better than controversy. And so I don't mean this as an attack on Jordan Peterson per se, but I do want to address what I think is sort of the intellectual framework that you find not just in Peterson. It's representative of some problems that you see consistently, and so hopefully this will be helpful in a grander sense. So it's nothing against him personally. It's just sort of an issue of thinking and trying to use evidence, particularly as we're adjusting to a new world of social media and YouTube videos. Just like with literacy, it took time to adjust to how to read and understand and organize data and check for veracity, these sorts of issues. We're having to learn this again as the world moves into this digital format where we have podcasts and YouTube videos and blogs that disappear and cite things that their citations disappear. And so we're in sort of a fuzzy transitional period again, and so we're having to learn. And so I'm sort of want to pitch it in that tenor. Also, I'm preparing my next lecture series, which will be on the British philosophers, and I'm waiting for some material, some hard-to-get material that I haven't been able to track down yet, and some unresolved issues in my mind. So I thought I would take some time to do three videos called the Problem series. And number one here is the problem of Jordan Peterson. And as I mentioned, I've been requested dozens of times to address Peterson, and so here's an attempt to do that. What I find troubling with Peterson's videos and his general arguments is there's a certain level of often misleading or intellectual dishonesty associated with him. And I never know if he means to do it purposefully or if he just thinks that this is correct and he hasn't bothered to check or research or really ponder in a greater extent. And so this is one of the problems that I encounter repeatedly when I try to watch his videos. And so just one example of this tendency in his thought, and he has a video that's actually been extracted from a longer lecture. You can see a couple of them called "You Would Have Been a Nazi." This is the thing. You know what? If you had lived in Nazi Germany, you would be a Nazi. So, don't throw too many stones. And so this is an interesting question. And I thought to myself, okay, would I have been a Nazi if I had lived in Nazi Germany? This is a very interesting ethical question. Like, how much are we shaped by our environment? How much is innate to us? How much is, family? How much is friends? How much is this culture? The different forces that can play on us. This is a hugely fascinating ethical and sociological realm of research and experimentation, and many thousands of pages of intellectual history have been dedicated to pondering these kinds of questions. And Peterson's answer is, he just says straight out, yeah, you almost certainly would have been a Nazi. And I don't like to think of myself as being a Nazi, so I'd like to take a pause and go, well, is that correct? And in my case, I can be sure I wouldn't have been a Nazi, not for any grand moral reason, although I like to think that as well, but simply because I'm not a joiner of things, right? I've tried occasionally to join things. I'm not good at it. So I'm a member of no committees, institutions, groups. I just can't do it. So I'm and I think that's just personally disabled from participating in large groups, and that's okay. So that made me feel better on first evaluation. But then I said, what about other people? And in this clip, or if you watch the longer video, you will see versions of this online. He makes a number of claims. First, he says, the Germans stood by idly while millions of their fellow Jewish citizens were killed. Now, I don't want to nitpick. I do not like nitpicking on details. I misstate facts. I'll misquote people. I've made errors on dates, name pronunciations. When you're doing a lot of material, and I lecture without notes generally, so errors occur. So I don't want to just make this seem like, oh, he made a slip of the tongue or something. But he clearly says millions, and he says this in more than one video. So I'm like, okay, this is error number one, factually inaccurate. In fact, it's a crucial error in a way, because there weren't millions of Jews in Germany. This is the crazy thing about the Nazi obsession with Jews, is that there weren't any, well, there were Jews in Germany. There were perhaps 500,000. So much less than 1% of the population of Germany was Jewish. And, so this is like in America, if we had decided that all of the problems in America were being caused by, I don't know, Croatian immigrants. There may be more than 1% of the population of the United States is Croatian. I'm trying to think of something so tiny, right? It's less than 1% of the population, and they're causing all the problems. So there were less than 500,000 Jews in Germany to begin with. About 300,000 of them immigrated as they realized that the situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Germany was not a place to be if you were Jewish. About 180,000, 60,000, nobody knows exactly, way too many. One is way too many, were killed during the war. And amazingly, somehow, incredibly, about 40,000 survived. So they killed of the citizens, of their Jewish citizen neighbors, about 180, 200,000, 160,000. Were killed. Now this is a huge, terrible, massive number, but it wasn't millions. This is the key idea here. This is the weird thing again. There weren't millions of Jews. The citizens did not stand by and watch them be murdered. So this was not part of of all the crimes they committed. Weirdly, millions of German Jews killed. Now they killed the Jews. That's why you had to invade Poland. They had to go get the Jews to kill them, which is again part of the bizarreness and the insanity of the system. So that's just wrong on the merits of it. And then if you look, well, how many members were there of the Nazi Party? So there was about 10% of the adult population of Germany ever joined the Nazi Party. So one way you could think of it is it's a very high bar, though. You don't have to be a Nazi Party member to support the Nazis. But the most votes they ever achieved in an election was 33% of a popular vote. This is before, of course, the popular vote was ended. And so if you take a very low bar and say, well, anybody who ever voted for the Nazi Party was, a Nazi supporter and, a member of supporting all this movement and all that, then if you take that as a bar, then at most 33% of the adult voting population of Germany were active Nazis. And of course, 33% of the adult voting population is less than 33% of the population, but let's just say 30%, right? We'll give it an upper level. Well, what that means is about 70% of the population were not Nazi members. We're not supporters of the Nazis. We're not members of the party, did not vote for the party, and either were indifferent to or actively resisted and were hostile to the existence of the party. So actually, statistically, you would have almost certainly not been a member of or supporter of the Nazi Party if you were in Germany at that time. Now, you may have put your head down when they became a totalitarian dictatorship and started shooting people who disagreed with them. That, does that make you a supporter? And so the question that he answers is actually an ethically really complex and subtle question that needs to be explored, which is, when does trying to survive become complicity, become support, right? It's that ethical arc between, hey, we're in occupied France. How much fighting did we do? How much collaboration did we do? Karl Jaspers, survived the war with his wife, smuggling Jewish citizens out, helping them get out of the country. Was on the death list, but he didn't take up a gun and try and kill Nazi officials. So it's where is that line? But so this is an interesting and morally ambiguous and tough ethical set of questions. A great book here, by the way, great book. I don't know if you can call it a great book. It's called Hitler's Willing Executioners that explores this question. And so great, it's an intellectually rich and challenging book. But, so the answer is not, A, it's not very clear, and B, statistically, you probably wouldn't have been a Nazi, which I think is gratifying to know, historically speaking. That, maybe, again, 60 to 70% of the population really didn't support them, didn't want anything to do with them, and was just trying not to get killed like everybody else during the war. So why does that matter? Why do these two errors matter? Well, a third error that he makes is he says, well, we know this is true anyway because of these experiments that have been run, like the Stanford prison experiment. And this has been now famously part of the replication problem in social sciences, where it turns out that many of these famous studies, like the Stanford prison experiment, when rerun, turn out not to be true. And also the original studies themselves have turned out to be completely falsified. Like they were not valid experiments. The reporting was inaccurate. The participants were coached. They're just wrong. There's no scientific validity to them at all. And then again, when they try to rerun the experiments, as they famously did in the Stanford prison experiment, nothing happened. So in this experiment, if you're not familiar with this famous experiment, originally it was claimed that a bunch of regular college students were selected. Some of them were made prisoners, some of them were made guards, and after a couple of days, the guards had turned totally sadistic and were torturing the prisoners, and the prisoners were, collapsing and terrible things and screams and all this. And so there you go. Given the opportunity, just regular old average college students will become sadistic prison guards and torture people. That was theoretically what it proved. And it turns out not only is this wrong, it's actually counter. When they rerun the experiments, so the BBC the BBC did this, they tried to do it, and it turns out that the guards and the prisoners just became friends and hung out smoking together and sort of spent the week trying to, come up with some fun ways to pass the time, which is in keeping with a lot of other evidence. But I do not believe that this experiment had been falsified in particular, but there's a lot of evidence in the sociological research to suggest that the Stanford experiment was in fact false already. It was just, totally disproven in like the last 4 or 5 years. So here he cites a flawed, in fact, inaccurate study, and there's a lot of counter evidence. And as someone who consistently claims that, I'm only looking at the facts, I'm just a scientist, this is what I do, he's giving wrong historical data. He's giving inaccurate counts of the Jewish population in Germany and the number that were killed in Germany. And he's giving a totally misrepresentative of the statistics of the people in Germany themselves. So why? What is the point of this? Well, the point, as far as I can determine, is to suggest that, look, deep inside, we're all bad people. We're all just Nazis waiting to allow to express our deepest, worst urges. Now, this is a long-running philosophical debate. And the question is, are people fundamentally good? Are people fundamentally bad? How do we fall in the range? How many people are pretty evil? How many people are pretty decent? And it turns out that it's pretty easily and convincingly showed, if you look at the accumulation of research plus the existence of human civilization for millennia, that on average, most people are pretty decent. I mean, in fact, actually, on average, most people are incredibly decent, fabulously decent. They're amazingly cooperative and helpful. That doesn't mean we don't have sociopaths. It doesn't mean that we don't have wars and these other problems. But in some ways, those are outliers that need to be explained, rather than assuming like, we're all evil and we're just waiting for a chance to kill our neighbors. Hence, we would all be Nazis. And so what looks like a very, just off the cuff, hey, you would be a Nazi, that's just the way it is. We have these experiments that prove it. Look at these Nazis. The Germans just stood around while millions and millions of their citizens were killed, is a sort of a cover for a deeper ethical argument that is that, we're fundamentally bad. We're fundamentally, and that we need to be constrained and contained and controlled, or else, it'll be chaos and it'll be murder in the streets. And that is something that happens not just with Peterson, but with a lot of speakers, where what they seem to be claiming with obvious, sometimes dubious, sometimes not, in this case, very dubious claims, is in fact just a thin veneer over what is in fact a moral or ethical claim that for some reason they don't want to address directly. And it's just much easier if they would say, hey, I think that people are fundamentally evil, and that's what we want to talk about. Instead, he says, look, just look at history. It's just the facts. The facts are the Stanford experiment, that everybody in Germany was a Nazi and they watched millions of their citizens die and be murdered. Well, they didn't. I mean, it's not okay to watch 180,000 of your citizens be murdered, but in a country of over 60 million people, when you think about the number of people who are incarcerated in the United States, not that that's a direct equivalent, but you see the problem, right? Like, when am I complicit in a system? What are the ethical ramifications? These are questions, not answers. These are problems, not things that you just say are solutions. And then most directly, the statistics are that at most 30% of Germans sort of either directly or indirectly supported the Nazi parties by voting of them. 70% didn't. And so, again, you probably would not have been a member of the Nazi Party, even in the extreme conditions of the Weimar Republic, the sort of dissolution of the Weimar Republic. Most people still didn't go that direction, which I think is kind of impressive in a way. So, good on us. So to know that, hey, you know what? Even in a very extreme economic and social environment, you probably would not have been a Nazi. So, that's what the evidence actually shows. A second example here is, he says, Mr. Peterson says, the terrifying IQ statistics. So he's got this lecture. He's actually delivered this, a couple of versions of this again. And what he says is that the most terrifying IQ statistic is that the military, U.S. military won't let anybody with an IQ below, I think, 85 into the military. And 10% of people drafted during World War I and World War II and Vietnam War didn't meet that threshold. Therefore, what that tells us is that 10% of the population is essentially mentally incapable of participating in society. That's terrifying. Now, again, this is an answer rather than a question. So, one problem is the military does not give an IQ test. They're very adamant about this. They keep saying this. They give aptitude tests. Now, some scientists have said, okay, we can take that aptitude test and translate those results into the equivalent of an IQ test. So, okay. Now, there's a question. I got a whole video on whether or not IQ tests have any validity or if there is such a thing as IQ. But I'm just going to accept for this argument that there is such a thing as IQ. But step one is to recognize the military doesn't test for IQ. They repeatedly claim this. They also say the test should not be translated into an IQ. Some people say you can do this. Some people say you can't do that, it's not a valid transition between the two. But okay, so we have an 85 IQ. 10% of the population don't meet this IQ, so they can't serve any function in the military, which Peterson then extrapolates to say that these people have no functional role in a society. If your IQ is so low that you can't do anything in the military, that means really there's no place for you functioning in a society. And that this is terrifying. And that, by the way, there's no way to help these people. He's adamant about this. There's absolutely nothing you can do for them. They're just a write-off, and that's terrifying. And several things here. One, I don't know why this is terrifying. Why would we expect in any diverse, rich, large culture that 100% of the people would be contributing, participatory, members? There's actually, that would be bizarre, right? There's no reason to expect that. In fact, the notion that only 10% of our population isn't particularly well suited to making a contribution seems small, right? I actually think that's probably a low count. Maybe the people don't have low IQ. They might have other things. They might just be disinterested in participating. They might just be lazy. They might just rather not, right? I mean, the whole notion, they might be, they might do bad things, right? I mean, mental illness, right? Why is 10% this terrifying number? Because I would actually argue that this should be considerably higher. Two, again, I don't know why this is terrifying, because it's like, really, this is the question. Okay, let's assume this is true, that this number has some validity, which, again, I'm hugely dubious on, but let's say it has some validity. Then the question is, okay, what is the ethical response for your society? See, it's not an answer to say it's terrifying. When you scare people and put fear in their minds, it keeps them from thinking. So when people try to scare you with numbers and say this is terrifying and this is horrible and this is awful and oh my gosh, what they're doing, either purposefully or inadvertently, is keeping you from thinking. So rather than saying this is terrifying, it should be like, okay, the evidence suggests that 10% of our population has such a low IQ. assuming that exists, that they can't participate. It's like, great, can't participate constructively. All right, so what should an ethical society do? How should we respond? What is the right way for a culture to respond, knowing that this is true? And there's any number of responses. You could have, in many societies, they say, hey, this is the family's issue. This is what families do. Or you can say, well, we'll create a certain number of jobs that are just really pretty simple, but they need doing, and we'll just let these people do it. Or, we'll just have a sort of a safety net that provides for them. Or you could just say, we let them rot, right? So historically, there's many responses to what you do with people who don't seem to be able to function very well in your culture. And this is not a terrifying thing. It's an ethical question that I think is fascinating to explore in a society where you go, wow, yeah, if we have an increasingly complex, diverse, and challenging society, what do we do with people who, for whatever reason, just go, well, this doesn't work for me? Oh, how do you respond to that? And of course, this could be exacerbated, or is being exacerbated potentially, if we get the robot thing down. Right now, what do we do when robots are doing 80% of the jobs that might currently being done by people? Whoa! So now all of a sudden that 10% number becomes 80%. What's the ethical way of responding? So this is there's been a lot of science fiction books written about this, right? So this, this question is not terrifying. It's just an ethical question. But notice, once I say it's terrifying and this is fixed and that there's nothing you can do, then you go, oh, well, it's just nothing society. There's no reason to try and help those people. And also notice those people are not identified, but it's this great trick of allowing the viewer or the listener or the reader to go, oh, well, I'm going to fill in the blank there. So the people I don't like, I'm going to say, well, they're just helpless. There's no reason for the government or me or anybody else to try to help whoever identifies as the people I don't like, because they're beyond help. Rather than saying, okay, this is the issue. Now, what is an ethical society to do? And so rather than, again, address a deeper problem, it's a surface, and it's a terror, and it's fear, and there's nothing we can do, so don't even bother. And it only takes the slightest extrapolation to say, and he actually comes very close to saying this in one of the videos, like, well, so social programs are a total waste, right? Because the government should never spend money on social programs because those people are just worthless. You can't help them. He actually says you can't help them in so many words. And it's like, what do you mean you can't help them? You can help them. I mean, we know for a fact you absolutely can help people. That's not even controversial. The history of mankind is that you can help people. You cannot help them too, by the way. That's also clear in the history of mankind. You cannot help them if you don't want to, but if you want to, often you can help people pretty well. Helping people, we've done this for millennia. So it shuts down your thinking. It makes an argument that's useless to help people. They're not helpable, so don't help them. But it sounds like it's just, a bunch of science and facts, even though it's neither science nor facts. And then finally, by the way, I'll just briefly, he does take a run at Nietzsche in a couple of videos, and he has this trick where he says that Nietzsche was a critic of the institution of Christianity, but then he says things, he says this thing about the church, and he says that thing about the church, and he says this about the Old Testament had some values that he liked, and these kinds of. So Nietzsche in places referred to himself as the Antichrist. In fact, it's pretty clear that one of the problems he had in his thinking, by the way, was the whole women issue. So he's terrible on that front. I mean, wow, such a blind spot, such a bias. But another problem he had is he was so anti-Christian that it actually messes up his thinking in places. You can see this as functionally. He is so virulently and aggressively opposed to Christianity that it is almost unbelievable. And so just to note that trick, right, to say, he's opposed to the institution of the church, but then says nice things in other places. And he does point out, historically factual things, some things from the Old Testament. That's true. But in any even brief reading through Nietzsche's material, much less any comprehensive reading through, what you recognize is that, man, he absolutely loathed the church. And to imply that it was and the whole idea of Christianity, and to imply somehow that it's just the instantiation in the Roman Catholic Church or in a particular religion is absurd. I mean, he was anti Christianity at its root branch, its ideas, its concepts, the way it's delivered, the whole thing. So again, there's that just subtle distinction. Oh, so it makes it sound like he hated the church, that maybe he liked other things. No, I mean, no, that's just misleading. But finally, and I think this presents maybe the clearest one, is a whole series of videos where he talks about the fact that, hey, look, men are more aggressive than women at the extremes. So we put on a bell curve. Men are on average more aggressive than women. I mean, women are not that much less aggressive than men, but men are at the extremes. Almost all the extremely aggressive people are men. And of course, you look at crime statistics, this bears this out. Men commit the vast majority of crimes, the vast majority of violent crimes. There are some women in there, but vast majority men. And he says, right, so in a society where you're rewarding excellence and commitment and work, of course, men are going to rise to the top of every hierarchy because they're just more aggressive, and that's what you need at the top of your hierarchy. So women not only shouldn't be expected to be up there, but women don't even want to be those jobs. They don't want those jobs. They don't want to be head of law firms and corporations and all this, because it's just a bunch of crazy aggressive men, and they don't want their lives to be like this. Therefore, the inequality you see is not the outcome of a system that's rigged against women. It's the outcome of just a perfectly reasonable system that naturally selects for the best possible people to fill positions that, and then aggressiveness is what you want in those positions. So, of course, men get them, not from bias, but because they're just naturally gifted for aggressiveness. And so when you select for hyper-aggressiveness, you're just going to have a lot of men running everything. And again, women don't want those jobs because they want, work-life balance, and they want to have families and this sort of thing. And so they just say, forget it. I'm not going to participate in this. And he gives numbers and says, now notice again, some of this is true. On average, men are more aggressive than women. It's a bell curve thing. Women aren't that much less aggressive, but at the extremes, it is true. Most aggressive things are men. Great. So there you go. Now, everything falls apart after that, of course. Again, the question is not, therefore, men run everything. The question is, why would you select for aggressiveness? Is this a good selection criteria? Now, in some instances, selecting for aggressiveness does make sense. In many other instances, selecting for aggression is suicide. It's a bad idea. And so, I may have mentioned this once before, actually, but if you look at airline pilots, many of the accidents are caused because the pilots are flying in a weather they should not be, or they're trying to land in situations that are not safe. Why? Because they're aggressive. Many airline pilots actually come from the military, which selects for aggressiveness. And so you get aggressive men flying aggressively and killing everybody on board the plane, right? That's the aggression selection criteria is bad. Do not select for that. And if you start thinking about this, you'll recognize, why do we want to select for aggressiveness? Why would we select for people who, for instance, maybe say, if you want this job, you have to work 80 hours a week? Why? Why is that a selection criteria? Why couldn't you say, no, the maximum you can work is 50 hours a week? That's the goal. And so working more than that is pointless and unhealthy, and we don't want people to do that. And so we're not going to select for people who are insane enough to do something that way. So again, it assumes, it assumes what it should be actually discussing. The interesting question this raises is not that, we have a bunch of aggressive men running things, because I think that's fairly clear. The question is whether that's a good idea, right? Is this a good selection criteria? Maybe in some cases it is. Often, I think you can make a pretty damn good argument that having a lot less aggressive people would be helpful for everyone involved. And that perhaps the selection criteria of aggression is suspect. One can also imagine a situation where suddenly our selection criteria become biased towards those people we like, men who just happen to be aggressive, rather than other qualities that might be more equally distributed, or, hey presto, might actually be unequally distributed towards women, in which case we could create a model in which we say, hey, what we want to select for are these qualities that are slightly more representative in women, and that you find a vast majority of on the extremes in women. So you could select for that. So for instance, if we went towards a highly participatory sort of communal communication setting as a way of running corporations, this would slightly select for women who, it turns out, select, again, when you look at the bell curves, the research suggests that they do prefer, on average, to work communally, right? This is their bias slightly in that direction, on an extreme. And it's not as extreme as aggressiveness, clearly, but that could be a selection criteria. Say, hey, we want communal decisions made by groups, and therefore we're going to select for women because they're going to be a lot better at doing that, and so on. If you have a group of 12, you're probably going to have 9 women and 3 men or something like that. And then you can just say, well, that's what we select for, and therefore we just happen to get women because that's what they're better at. Now, whether that would be a better system, that's the discussion. This is the ethical question that we want to be thinking about. It's not an answer to say, well, aggression is natural, we select for aggression, so there you go. This is the outcome. It's like, why do we select for aggression? Is it a good idea? And again, if we're Vikings invading a bunch of countries at random and fighting all the time, selecting for aggression probably makes some sense. If we're in a communal setting where we work in groups to achieve, say, agriculture or something, selecting for aggression is a terrible idea. And so many ancient societies, and in fact many modern societies, do not select that way. And so it's neither a necessary nor an obviously good selection criteria, even if the outcome, once you've accepted it, would be to produce a bunch of men in charge of everything. So, that argument is simply, it's specious. It's a non-argument. It assumes the conclusion. What you're supposed to be what you could be discussing is say, hey, what would be a good way of organizing a society? What would be a good way? What sort of ethics would we like to see in our leaders? It's not like, and by the way, this is not like a new philosophical question. Again, Plato's Republic springs to mind, although horrible in every way, it did ask this question. And that's the beauty of Plato, who I often say bad things about. But the beauty of Plato is that he asked the question quite clearly: what would be the best way of organizing a society? What values do we want our leaders to have? How do we want the people to be? Asked it correctly, clearly, and explored it in detail. Now, his conclusions, wow. Can't go along with those, but, it is direct and clear, and he's asking the question and then pursuing it, rather than giving an answer. Oh, well, you just select for aggression because nothing else makes sense, and there you go. It's just natural, quote unquote, natural. So in each of these examples, what you see, by the way, and so the greater argument that can be drawn from this, and by the way, which Peterson is generally careful to avoid, is simply that, yeah, women are in second-rate positions and don't get the pay and aren't in power because they just don't want those jobs, and therefore they don't get them because they don't want them. They don't work hard enough to get them, and they just, that's just the way women are, and so we shouldn't suspect anything else. And plus, men don't want the jobs either. They're crazy for getting them. All that power and money, nobody wants that. They want to be, you should want to be at home with your family and not worry about the power and money. So, right. So in almost every case, and it's also, I should say, it's not that Peterson's not making any good points. He does make good points. He does have interesting observations. However, consistently as a pattern in his thinking, what you see is these facts, quote unquote, sometimes which aren't facts, but sometimes which are in fact reasonable data. But they're presented in a way where really deep, important philosophical questions: how do you organize an ethical society? What is the fundamental nature of human beings? Are we good or evil? What's the mix, and how do we know? What is our relationship to God, and how should we think about Christianity? He frames these as if a small set of data and a few quotes answers a question in a very large question, sort of with finality. It's just the science. It's just the evidence. There's nothing else that can be done. And to argue against, any of this is simply to refuse to accept the facts as they are, and to sort of blur your mind with some sort of mishmash of ideology and misinformation and mistake on the world, which of course happens a lot. We do blur our minds with ideology and mistakes on the world, but just waving your hand does not make these deep philosophical questions go away. And it would be better to address them directly and say, is aggression an ethical way to select, or a good way, a beneficial way to select for your leaders? How do you deal with the position part of your society that just doesn't function that well in it? That's a great question, fascinating question. What do we do about the notion of some people do organize themselves and do really evil things? And why does that happen? And why is it actually rarer than you might expect? And what are the conditions under which it does occur, and how could we avoid those conditions? Rather than saying, oh, you would have been a Nazi, yeah, there's nothing you can do, and yeah, women don't want those jobs. Oh, and Nietzsche was okay with Christianity. So it gives this veneer of an answer by really avoiding the questions, the deep underlying philosophical questions, and acting as if the answers are clear and supported by science, which they're not. Science tells us very little about these things. And that is a consistent theme, not just in Peterson's thought, but in many videos that are short and try to address from one angle or another what are really millennia-long vexing questions that no one's been able to really come to full conclusions on. So why would we expect them to be resolved so easily and quickly now? And so that's what I would get people to sort of ponder, if you will, is the need to ponder. Less answers, more questions. Less conclusions, more reflection, I guess. And just be leery. Be leery of things I say. Check my dates, check my facts, check my quotes, make sure I get them right. Because I do make mistakes, right? Human beings. But hopefully not a pattern of misrepresentation. And again, I decided to do this because so many people have asked me about the Peterson things that I started thinking of it in my own mind as the Jordan Peterson problem. Because apparently he is so prominent, and he does talk in theory, about vaguely related issues, but not just with Peterson. I think this is a good approach with everything. We often we want to run towards conclusions rather than begin with what we don't know, and ponderings and diversity and complexity. And rather than trying to resolve those, maybe we just have to often live with them and just say, hey, it's a complex world, and some of this is perhaps not resolvable in any absolute sense. So, number one in the problem series, the problem with Jordan Peterson. Thank you very much.